I'd like to start with a quote from Jan Richardson, writing in The Sanctuary of Women. Jan says, "This is what I know. There are prayers inscribed in our bones, prayers we carry in our marrow, prayers that run through our blood. There are prayers that we carry with ancestral memory, prayers passed down from generation to generation, prayers that spiral in our DNA." I use this opening quote from Jan to speak of Hildegard as part of our spiritual DNA. Her life and her works are an influence on us all, especially us Catholic Christians, but she also influences all seekers, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. This woman, this saint who lived so many years ago, poured out creativity in a great flood of works, and she did it for the church and for God, for the people around her, for the monks and for the nuns. Her God and her Christ were everywhere. They sparkled in the waters. They shone in creation. They danced in song, her songs, the songs of the Opus Dei, the divine office, sung faithfully day by day and year by year by her nuns in the monastery. June Boyce Tillman writes in The Creative Spirit, a song about Hildegard of Bingen that I think sums up quite a bit of what her life was about. Here are some lines from that song. Hildegard of faith unbending, feather on the breath of God, world of substance all transcending, treading paths as yet untrod, in discernment traveled forward, penetrating wisdom's knot, lonely woman, silence keeping, till the time to speak came near, justice for a whole creation underpinned your message clear. I think Boyce Tillman sums up here in a few phrases some major themes and the richness of Hildegard of Bingen. Her theology was wisdom-based. Her vision saw all of creation. Recently, in 2012, after 9 centuries, Hildegard has been crowned by Pope Benedict as Saint and Doctor of the Church. She joins 3 other women to become only the 4th woman doctor of the Church. And so she joins Teresa of Avila, Therese of Lisieux, and Catherine of Siena, and she becomes the 4th woman doctor of the Church. She has waxed and waned through the centuries, and yet here she is. More and more people are discovering her today. She is the saint who won't let go. Her lion heart and her subtle and embracing intellect speak to us today. Let's do a little overview of Hildegard's life, and we're going to return to some of the events in her life later and go into them with more detail. Hildegard was born in 1098 in the German village of Bermersheim, located in the verdant Rhine Valley of Germany near Mainz. She was probably the 10th child of 10. She was born to a noble family. Her father was a knight and her mother was a lady. And so we have a little girl living comfortably on the family estate. She was always a visionary from a very young age. One story that's reported in her Vita is that at age 4, she predicted the color and spots on an unborn calf, surprising everyone, I am sure. She later innocently asked her nurse, "Well, don't you have visions?" and was surprised when the nurse said, "No, I do not." It was just an inkling of the beginning of Hildegard knowing that she was different from everybody else. When she was just 8 years old, she became a child oblate. Her parents gave her to the church. Oblate, obligation have the same root, so we can see that she was now under obligation to the church. She would be a nun for all of her life. She was placed under the care of another noble woman, Jutta of Spenheim. Child oblates were not unusual for the time. In fact, it was a common practice. She may have been a tithe, being the 10th child, or judged not suitable for marriage and family life because of her ongoing visionary life, a dreamy child destined for religious life. We're not sure exactly where she was between age 8 and age 14. She may have been living with Jutta with a widow in the area, a holy widow. But we do know that in 1112, she and Jutta entered the anchor hole, some small rooms. So anchor, something that is anchored to the church, a small cloister, where she lived with Jutta, shut off from the world. And it was at the Benedictine monastery of Disibodenberg, just some miles from where she had been born. Disibodenberg is an ancient religious site. A monastery was established way back by the Celtic saints. So they entered the small group of rooms, Jutta and Hildegard, and spent their time in handiwork, prayer sung with the monks through a window 7 or 8 times a day, Mass received through the window. They were, in effect, held at Disibodenberg, safe from the world, and it was thought that women achieved salvation in this way. As time passed, other noble women came to join the pair, and the anchor hole became more of a women's monastery. This brought some measured freedoms for Hildegard, freedoms which I am sure she enjoyed. Getting out, going to the church itself, going to the scriptorium, the infirmary, the scriptorium being the place where manuscripts were copied and stored, the library, and so forth. There would have been large gardens at the monastery as well, and herbs used for healing. And this began to nurture Hildegard's early interest in the healing arts. When Jutta died in 1136, Hildegard became the leader of this small woman's monastery, attached to the men's monastery at Disibodenberg. She was the leader, or magistra, chosen by the sisters. And here we see early signs of Hildegard's leadership, and I'm sure she was kind to the other sisters, or they would not have elected her. In 1141, a major thing happened. She had a grand vision that led to her first written work, Scivias. In this major vision, she was commanded by God to write down what she had been shown. She experienced many days of illness as she struggled to figure out how she was going to do this. She was just a woman, an uneducated woman. How was she going to write what she had been shown? Working with Fulmar, a monk at Disibodenberg, and Richardis, a favorite nun, they begin to secure permissions, and I'm going to go into that in more detail in later lectures. And you know, this whole incident just shows how Hildegard could use both her heart and her head as she figured out how to get her work to go forward. She created a disturbance, much to her chagrin, in 1150, when she decided that she must separate from the monks at Disibodenberg and move her monastery to Rupertsberg, another Celtic site not too far away. Rupertsberg was on the Rhine River, and it was an ancient religious site, but the monastery there was in ruin, and Hildegard had to build a new one from scratch for her nuns, and she struggled for many years to establish a stable monastery there. We'll be talking about that in more detail as well. During this time, she continued to write the major work Scivias, based on her vision of 1141, and then completed two more major texts, the Book of Life's Virtues and the Book of Divine Works. The Latin names for all these creations will be in your study guide, so you'll have those to refer to. Hildegard wrote the world's first operatic morality play, The Works of Virtue. She penned poetry and music for her nuns to sing. She even invented her own language that was used in the monastery, and she composed 300 letters of reprimand and advice to popes, kings, lay people, all sorts of people were under her influence. After establishing the monastery at Rupertsberg, she founded another woman's monastery across the Rhine at Bingen, and you know it's still there today. I have visited there. It's a beautiful place. Working in the healing arts in her monasteries, she wrote two scientific texts, Physica and Causes and Cures. In 1158, she began prophetic preaching tours. She undertook 4 of these tours. Now that's amazing that a woman was allowed to preach in that day and time. She was listened to because people believed her words came directly from God. In 1178, she and her nuns were punished for refusing to remove a young man from their graveyard. The prelates of Mainz said he was a rebel, but Hildegard knew that he had been confessed and shriven. How were they punished? They were denied the sacraments, and they were unable to sing the divine office, the Opus Dei. Hildegard stood her ground, and it was very scary for the nuns. Their thoughts were, if we die during this time, we're going to hell. Very, very scary and harsh for them. Hildegard wrote letters, and after a while she won the day, and the punishment was lifted. She died some months later and was almost immediately venerated as a saint in her area, even though it took many years for her to achieve official sainthood. Later, Hildegard would pen these words about herself. "O poor little figure of a woman, you who are the daughter of many troubles, plagued by a grave multitude of bodily infirmities, yet steeped nonetheless in the vastness of God's mysteries." This quote helps show us that Hildegard was and is a paradox. She lived the dichotomy of being. In her words, she was wretched for being a woman. She was someone who was often ill. And yet the boldness and lion-hearted nature of her spirit and mind cannot be denied. Reaching back through the centuries, we seek to capture her. Because one thing is true, she always lived in hope and she never gave up. And as we said in 2012, she was named Saint and Doctor of the Church. So we said the second purpose of this lecture was to discover why we should be interested. Why is it important today to learn about Hildegard? First of all, she's fascinating, and there's much available now in English about her life and her works. I will present some of this to you in the hope that you will want to discover more. And there will be a list of resources in your study guide to learn about Hildegard. She's inspiring, and she inspires us as Catholic Christians and as seekers today. Secondly, we want to embrace Hildegard's spirituality as relevant to our own lives and our faith. She herself would never have wanted to remain in universities and libraries. She was a church woman, and she reached out to people. She always wanted to help people in their faith. She wanted to influence people of faith. And I hope I can unveil her and make her a bit more accessible to you and to your life. And finally, it's important to know that Hildegard is both prophet and mystic. It's easy to see in her words, which you'll hear later, the prophetic quality of her words. Prophet meaning one who tells the truth about what God thinks and what God wants. But I want to make a case for her as a mystic as well. A mystic is simply one who experiences God in a unitive way. Hildegard tells us over and over that she was almost always in the presence of the shadow of the living light. I find this deeply mystical. She was touched by God from a young age, set apart. She is a woman of the ages, and yet she is a woman of our time. And she can lead us to discover our own mystic nature. The dates and the facts of Hildegard's life cannot capture her passion, her suffering, or her vast creative light. But it is my hope that as you proceed through this lecture series, you will discover many things about her that you will feel with both your head and your heart. The words of poet Kathleen Norris apply here. She says, "By what authority does the poet or prophet speak? How dare the poet say I and not mean the self? How dare the prophet say, thus says the Lord?" Norris continues, "It is the authority of experience, but by this I do not mean experience used as an idol, as if an individual's experience of the world were its true measure. I mean experience tested in isolation, as by the desert fathers and mothers, also tried in the crucible of community." We also talked in this lecture about why is Hildegard important for us today. And we talked about the fact that as a mystic and as a prophet, she speaks to us today. So I want to ask you to ask yourself some questions. Having heard a bit about Hildegard, are you interested in learning more? Do you see how she can relate to your life today? Hildegard always counseled fidelity and loyalty, sticking with the job. She wrote in a letter to a fellow abbess, "Mother, a person who doesn't plow a field to make it grow crops is negligent. She's shirking her work. She's refusing to till the field of her good master. In the same way that the stars illuminate the sky at night, God made humanity to sparkle. We're created for maturity. We're made to give out light like the sun, the moon, and the stars. If a black cloud covered these, the earth and every creature in the world would worry that the end had come." Hildegard continues, "Daughter of God, the field is yours. Your goodness embraces those in your care. Don't refuse to be their leader." Here we see the saint who won't let go, the saint who always is advocating loyalty and fidelity to the task at hand. So I hope you've seen some ways that Hildegard might be important to you, your life, and your journey. I hope that you have learned a bit about her as mystic and prophet and want to bring some of that mysticism into your own life. In our next talk, we'll see the historical underpinnings of Hildegard's life. We'll talk about where she was in history and some of those great figures that walked on the stage of history with her and influenced her life. Ask yourself the questions now. What might Hildegard mean to me? What might this great saint and doctor of the church have to tell me today? I hope that in future lectures we'll discover more and more of these ideas. Topic 2, the historical context of Hildegard of Bingen's life. Before we delve more deeply into events of Hildegard's life and begin to mine the gold of creativity lying there, it will be useful for us to consider the historical context in which she lived her life. And so, when we think about Hildegard, we must think about the Benedictine rule. She lived her entire life as a Benedictine nun. So let's unwrap that a bit. Who was Benedict, and where did the rule come from? Benedict tried with varying success to establish monasteries. He wanted to live an ascetic life. He gathered coteries of men around him and began to try to establish holy houses. As he struggled to form these communities, and it wasn't easy, he wrote the Rule of Benedict as a guide for a way of life. A famous story about this is that one of the early monasteries, the men attempted to throw him off a hill because the rule was so stringent. Well, either he learned to mitigate it or they began to understand it better, but it began to flourish. Charlemagne was a member of the Carolingian dynasty, a group of Frankish kings that consolidated power in Germany during most of the 8th and 9th centuries. They pressed for conformity and uniformity regarding liturgical practices in the Catholic Church. Their dynasty also brought forth a lot of stability in government. R.W. Southern, a historian, says this: the Carolingian family, the ruling family of Europe, had a genius for bringing order and regularity into every branch of social and religious life, not least into the regular life of religious communities. Under the Carolingians, art and the illumination of manuscripts also flourished, and artistic influences from the Eastern Church were brought into the West. This would be very important to Hildegard because she saw some of these illuminated manuscripts, and no doubt they influenced her own work. As the Benedictine order spread, many began to see in it an elevated way of life. In the book, The Benedictine Tradition, the authors say this, and I quote, "The rule of Benedict is known for its simplicity and balance. He, that is Benedict, took the essentials of the monastic way of life and concern for the interior spiritual journey, recognized the humanity of his simple follower, and exhorted them to begin with his simple practice." The editors further state Benedict's genius extended further, in that his rule quietly undermined the corruption and degradation of his time. His monastery was a place of peace. The outcast, the sick, and the poor were to be received as Christ, and all of life was recognized as holy. Charlemagne eventually insisted that all monasteries adopt the rule of Benedict. I once heard a Benedictine nun and a Franciscan nun talking. They were talking about how popular St. Francis is. And the Benedictine nun was kind of bemoaning the fact that Benedict wasn't nearly as popular in our present day. The Franciscan nun kindly said, "Well, He only saved Western civilization. That might be an overstatement, but as his rule spread, as he brought the cross, the plow, and the book across Europe, there was stabilization and an elevation of civilization. Also, the great classical works were preserved. I want you to visualize now the great stage of history. Benedict has set the stage for Hildegard. She is to be a Benedictine nun all her life, and in her monasteries will follow the rule of Benedict. She will sing the Opus Dei, or the Divine Office, psalm-based prayers, sung 7 or 8 times during the day. And in between there will be prayer and work. So on this large stage of history now, I want to introduce another important man and someone who was very important to Hildegard's life, and that was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux was born in 1090, about 8 years before Hildegard herself was born. And I want to compare and contrast Hildegard and Bernard of Clairvaux, and he will be very important in her life. They were both born of nobility, she being German, him French. He was very well educated in the classics, as men of his status and time were. Hildegard, much to her chagrin, was not able to obtain an education. She was self-educated and educated in Latin through the daily office and some tutoring, possibly. They were both poets, and they both loved Mary, the Mother of God, and wrote about her. They both founded monasteries. But think about this. Hildegard was a woman, uneducated, and in a traditional role for her time. Bernard of Clairvaux was an elite churchman. He wrote much and spoke much. He was one of the celebrity saints of his day. Both Hildegard and Bernard defended the church against encroachment by secular rulers. In 1113, when Bernard was 25 years old, he sought to enter a Benedictine monastery with 30 of his noble kinsmen. 2 years later, I am assuming it did not work out, he left to found a monastery in the valley of Clairvaux. The beginnings were painful and hard, as Benedict had discovered and Hildegard herself was to discover years later. The founding of a new monastery is often fraught with danger, discord, and suffering. Bernard founded the Cistercian order with the idea of living out the Benedictine rule to its fullest, so it was actually a form of Benedictine rule. He was trying to return to a time when it was more strict and pure. As we said, he was a wonderful writer and speaker. He assisted at the Council of Troyes in 1128. As Hildegard was to do as well, as we mentioned, I think, he defended the church against the encroachment of kings and princes. This was a time when power really was a ping-pong ball between the secular and the religious rulers. Both were always grasping for power. Who appointed who? Who had control of the lands? Who had control of the crops? All of these things, and the armies. Later in his life, Bernard was commissioned by the Pope to raise up support for the Third Crusade. The Emperor Barbarossa, Frederick I, and we're going to speak about him as well, he received the Crusade Cross from Bernard's hands for the Third Crusade. The crusade did not succeed, in part because of corruption in Jerusalem that Bernard could not control. And he suffered when a dear friend of his, Pope Eugene, and he also figures in Hildegard's life, died in 1153. But after Bernard of Clairvault's death, his wisdom, learning, and devotion were celebrated, and he, as Hildegard was to be much later, became a saint and doctor of the church. So let's bring onto the stage now King Frederick I, or Barbarossa, that is, Red Beard. Frederick I began his reign as King of Germany in 1152. Hildegard would have been 54 years old. There was a civil war going on, and Barbarossa was able to bring the factions together and broker a peace. He was a strong king. He knew of Hildegard and called for her to come and visit him and give him some prophecies. Much to his delight, she predicted that he would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, and he was in 1155. Barbarossa was to come into conflict with popes, however, because he was always trying to get more power for himself, claiming special rights for his kingship, including the right to appoint bishops. And when the king appoints bishops, they're usually just political figures. Little by little, Frederick I, or Barbarossa, lost most of his clerical support in Germany. And in 1177, he recognized Pope Alexander. Barbarossa, as we said, received that crusade cross from Bernard of Clairvaux. He died in that crusade. He drowned. He had an interesting relationship with Hildegard. He had her visit him, and she predicted his kingship. He gave orders of protection for her monastery, and I got to see one of those when I was in Bingen, a beautiful document. It might have been a facsimile, but I saw those orders of protection that kept her monastery safe. On the other hand, when he displeased her, when he tried to get unusual powers for his kingship, she wrote him very stern letters, very harsh letters. I would have been afraid to write an emperor such letters, but she did. And he never pulled his support away from her. He listened to her. Hildegard was an outspoken supporter of the rights of popes and bishops, but she constantly encouraged them to reform their lives. She knew about the corruption of the time. She wanted them to return to gospel values and to their original grace and purpose. She knew about the practice of simony, that is, the selling of clerical offices for money, and she very much disapproved of this. It is difficult for us today, modern people who live in a democracy, for the most part, most of you listening to me, to understand the Germany of Hildegard's day. We have many choices as to way of life and religion. In 12th century Germany, one was born into a way of life. Almost everyone began as a Catholic, and there were no choices there. And you didn't leave because you could be accused of heresy and put to death. The Germany of Hildegard of Bingen's day was very layered. It was a very layered society. At the top were religious and secular leaders, like kings and popes. And as we said, the men were always fighting over power. Under them was the nobility of the day. Hildegard, as a member of that nobility, learned early about influence and power. She always tried to use it for good, but she knew how to make family connections and connections with friends that it would help her advance her work. The nobility exerted much power in forming the monasteries. Most of the nuns came from nobility, and this was necessary because they brought with them dowries, monies, to help fund the monastery, lands and riches. And this was necessary to keep the monasteries going. The nobility knew a lot about forming alliances as well, and gaining more secular power for themselves. This is why Jutta of Sponheim's family did not want to let her go, because she, if you remember, Jutta was Hildegard's protector and mother figure when she left home. They did not want to let Jutta go because she was an ideal candidate for an advantageous marriage. But she bucked them and she was able to leave. So the nobility, they were always forming alliances, both in the monasteries and in secular life. There were many double monasteries at this time. And Disibodenberg, where Hildegard started out, this was a double monastery. When they were first cloistered there were only monks there. As their monastery grew, it became a thriving double monastery. It is important to note that the abbot of the monastery, in the case of Disibodenberg, it was Abbot Kuno, that he controlled all of the monies coming into the monastery from both the nuns and the monks. And we will see later, at one point, Hildegard really had to struggle to get control of some of her funds to establish a new monastery. The 12th century, when Hildegard lived, was the absolute height and flourishing of the Benedictine order. It was a mini Renaissance in the Middle Ages. The population was stabilizing and growing. This is long before the horrible Black Plague that decimated so many individuals. There was a growing prosperity. At the same time, as we said, at his rising, Barbarossa had to put down a civil war, so times were mixed, as times always tend to be. Yes, Hildegard would walk on a large stage with other great figures of history. They would influence her life and she would influence theirs, which is amazing as a woman that she stood with these great men figures of history. Hildegard said that she lived in an age when the male leaders were not living up to their potential, not doing what they should be doing. Popes were often involved in endless rounds of litigation and deciding suits between one party and another, and their powers were drained off by all these petty disputes between families. Hildegard of Bingen wanted church leaders to be both moral and strong. She wanted them to give sacraments to the people and teach them about their faith. She would work with her own prophetic words to build up church leaders and other Catholics, and she would never back away from any challenge when she felt right was on her side. And yet, Hildegard's way was to be a woman's path, an intuitive and visual journey of the heart as well as the mind. She was to feel her way forward. She was to see all things with her very soul. For she saw the wondrous mysteries of God all throughout history, and the God that kindled every spark of life. The historical times and context of Hildegard of Bingen enabled her to use her noble birth to her advantage, and we're going to learn about some of that through her relationships and through alliances and friendships. She could achieve her goals and bring her dreams to fruition. And place was important as well. We've talked about the historical context of Hildegard of Bingen's life and the growing prosperity of the time in Germany. And a lot of that prosperity was because the Rhine Valley, where Hildegard lived, was a green and verdant place. There were vineyards, there were wheat fields, there were animals grazing. And Hildegard saw all of this, and she took all of this into her soul. And it was part of her great creativity and her great writings as she was to go forward. So I hope as you have listened to a little bit of the history of Hildegard of Bingen and learned a bit about her and the context that she lived in, that you're ready to move on to other topics and really delve deeply into her life. In the next talk, we'll return to her young life, her childhood, and discover the thing that formed her, being enclosed in the cloister at Disibodenberg with Jutta. Topic 3, Jutta, Disibodenberg, and life in the anchor hold. Now that we have some of the history of Hildegard's life and times, let's look more closely at her particular path. We know that Hildegard was dedicated by her family as a child oblate, or child religious, at the tender age of 8, and put under the care of the noble Jutta of Sponheim. Barbara Newman, writing in The Voice of the Living Light, tells us that Jutta seems to have been, quote, fierce and independent. And I continue to quote Barbara. She says, from about 1106, she, that is Jutta, embarked on an unvowed religious life in the house of the Lady Uda, a widow of Golheim, possibly with the 8-year-old Hildegard already in tow. You can form a visual image of that. After the widow died, Jutta expressed a desire to go on pilgrimage, further indicating her spirit of adventure. But her brother Meinhard, later Count of Sponheim, thwarted the plan and persuaded her at age 20 to settle at the monastery of Disibodenberg. Disibodenberg was an ancient religious site and was the place of the new Benedictine abbey that was being constructed, and it was some miles from Hildegard's birthplace in Bermersheim. Jutta and Hildegard entered the monastery on 1112. Hildegard was 14 and Jutta was 20. There were also 1 or 2 other girls enclosed there, and quirkily, they were also named Jutta. These women first lived as anchoresses, that is, they were anchored to the church, sealed into cells attached to the monks' church at Disibodenberg. Writing in an article in Commonweal magazine entitled Sealed Yet Soaring, author Christine Stern says this: anchoresses had been popular during the 12th and 13th centuries in England, France, Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries. I continue this quote. By definition, an anchoress pledges herself to a life of prayer. They lived in a reclusorum, or anchor hold. The ceremony that accompanied going into this anchor hold was similar to a funeral service and signified that the women were to be dead to the world. In Hildegard's case, history would show nothing could be further from the truth. But for now, at age 14, she enters and is contained. Continuing to use Christine Stern's information, we find that typically an anchor hole contained 2 small windows. One opened into the church itself, usually with a view of the altar, so that the women could sing along with the monks the divine office and also receive Eucharist. Another window opened to the outside for food to come in and waste to go out. Stern says that this was usually covered with a cloth. Also, this window to the outside, pilgrims could come and speak to the holy anchoresses and get their advice and their prayers. Jutta began to be known as a very holy woman. To give you another example of this, a famous anchoress who lived after Hildegard in the 14th and 15th centuries in England was Julian of Norwich, also a visionary who is considered a very important mystic of the church. She wrote about her visions in Showings. Anchoresses like Jutta and Julian of Norwich were known for their purity, holiness, and wise counsel. And pilgrims, as we said, came to see them and receive their advice and blessings. This was very important to the monastery because these pilgrims brought alms, monies into the monastery, and thus enriched the coffers and enabled the life to flourish. Jutta was very hard on herself. She practiced bodily mortification, such as wearing a spiked chain, sleeping on the cold floor, fasting excessively. She refused meat for 8 years, even though the abbot told her she should eat meat, and flagellating herself. Hildegard was to disapprove of such severe practices, and Hildegard supported the moderation of the basic Benedictine rule. She advised people not to take more upon themselves than the rule advised them to do. Hildegard never wrote a great deal about Jutta, her erstwhile mother. She seems to have had a conflicted relationship with her. Hildegard of Bingen, while traditionally religious for sure, loved life and nature and people. She was passionate about people and their welfare. Jutta, on the other hand, had withdrawn from life as a way to obtain heaven. It is probable that Jutta's penances frightened and appalled Hildegard, but at any rate, she was forced to make the best of things there at Disibodenberg. We said in an earlier lecture that Hildegard's spirituality cannot be separated from the place in which she lived. We talked about the verdancy of the Rhine Valley, the crops that grew there. It was a temperate climate, even though the winters were cold. There were beautiful springs and falls and summers when the crops came in. The monastery site at Disibodenberg was an ancient religious site. Apart from legend, there's not a lot of source material covering its history. But this much is known. Around 675, the Irish monk Disibode settled in this former Celtic and Roman cult site. So this is one of those places that has been deemed holy from time immemorial. There have always been rituals going on there and prayers rising from there. So this Irish monk had settled there, along with 3 companions, establishing a small monastery. And then the Archbishop Willigis of Mainz, who lived between 975 and 1011, awarded important lands to the abbey and promoted expansion and building of the Augustinian monastery there. In the year 1098, and that's the year of Hildegard's birth, the Benedictines took over the site. Under the abbot Kuno, and we will hear a lot about him in future lectures, it was extensively expanded. The most important part of this being the building of a basilica with 3 naves and a cloister. And it was completed in 1143. So during most of Hildegard's time there was ongoing construction. And in Scivia's, one of her texts, she has a book, The Church is a Building. And historians have said that she got a lot of these images from that ongoing construction that was always going on around her. Hildegard, in one of her many writings, wrote the life story of the Bishop Disibode. This was toward the end of her life. In this book, she writes of the founding of Disibodenberg. This writing shows her own state of mind, I think, and her appreciation of the place. Those who wrote History of Saints didn't treat history the way we do. It's not so much about facts as it was about what we intuited about the person. She writes, "When he had traveled all around the peak and diligently examined all its slopes, its beauty satisfied his soul more and more as a place where he should dwell. Its height offered difficult access to those who came there, while the streams that flowed on both sides offered bodily refreshment to those staying there. And those streams are the Glon and the Nahe rivers that still flow today. Hildegard continues, he, that is Saint Disibode, prayed, saying, Lord, you reside above the heavens and rule the abyss. I pray that the beauty of this place may be turned to the beauty of souls, for it is fitting that you be served faithfully in this place by a faithful people. Having said this, he designated as his dwelling place a site on the eastern slope of the mountain because it had a supply of water. Hildegard says he began in earnest the way of life he had long wanted, praying, keeping vigil, and fasting. I visited Disibodenberg when I was in Germany, that place where Hildegard started out, and I'm going to quote from the book that I wrote that is being released as a companion to this tape series. Because this site where Hildegard first began made such an impression on me. It was not an easy place to find. I had a guide. And I'm using this place, these quotes about this place, because I understood in a more profound way the way place influenced Hildegard. So I said, I arrived on a misty afternoon. The weather had been changing all day, first rain, then some sun. Now the rain had stopped, but the leaves dripped silver, and the air was sober and quiet. I walked along a narrow path through old trees. I felt like the only person on the planet. I felt singled out and blessed, called to have an experience with God and with Hildegard's spirit. There are certain places in the world that have been venerated as holy sites since time began, and this is one of them. Here at Disibodenberg, where two rivers converge, there's a certain feel to the landscape that is vibrating and enclosing. There's a holding of the sacred within the very air, an intangible or invisible imprint left by centuries of ritual and prayer. There are large stone ruins all around. Using a visitor's guide, I discovered the oldest ones. Mere stones now, the place where Hildegard would have lived in her earliest days as an anchoress. Yes, just small parts of the foundation remain, but her spirit is so near. I can close my eyes and see her. I can certainly feel her. All around me is the green of nature, evergreen trees, patches of wildflowers. Hildegard could have looked out of a window and beheld, as she later wrote, the fruits of the earth ripened by the blowing of the winds. I thought to myself, this must be one of those thin places they talk about. Writing online, Carl McColman, the author of the Big Book of Christian Mysticism, tells us that in Celtic spirituality, we hear about these thin places. And he tells us that themes such as hospitality, pilgrimage, the sacredness of nature, and the loving presence of divine mystery imbue these thin places that are so celebrated in Celtic spirituality. And remember, this was a Celtic site. I think that in a thin place, the wall between us and the sacred presence thins. We experience a unity. And I experience this feeling so strongly in Disibodenberg. I write in my book, too, that in that cloister in Disibodenberg, the cloister was like an alchemical vessel for Hildegard. There was a sacred alchemy going on that was transforming her from a dreamy, vision-infused girl into a great woman. She was destined to make her mark on the world, but she didn't know it yet. June Boyce Tillman quotes Hildegard, "O counselor of souls, and O primal voice, which called us all into being, we are praying to you, that in your strength we may find freedom from our misery and our general weakness." Hildegard was plagued by many illnesses. But this image of God, Boyce Tillman says, as a heavenly counselor, could be seen as rooted in Hildegard's own experience of lostness. She was oblated at age 8 and sent to another place and then to this place. We don't know how much she saw her family after that, but in this initial displacement from home to Dissy-Bodenberg were the roots of her later work. It was in this place that Hildegard was to overcome this sense of lostness with God's help. Enclosed in a few small rooms, hearing the prayers of the church sung 7 or 8 times a day, she learned rudimentary Latin, sewing, and to play a simple musical instrument. We don't know how much dark night of the soul she had, but we do know that prayer became her life and her hope. Author Thomas Moore tells us, "A dark night of the soul is dark because it doesn't give us any assurance that what is happening makes sense and will ultimately be beneficial. We can't understand what is happening to us, and if we are in the habit of always wanting to know what is going on, this aspect of the dark night will be maddening. We can find meaning in these times of change, but we have to think differently about our lives." Moore goes on to say that at these times we must take our lives seriously. We must form a philosophy of life. We need to develop complex and flexible ideas. I believe that all these words fit Hildegard as she is encased in the anchor hole. This place is to be of utmost importance to her. Here she will begin to form her philosophies of life. Here she will have her greatest vision. Here she will meet her helpmate, Volmar, and her beloved nun, Richardis von Stade. Here she will suffer, thrive, and grow into her greatness. Later, she will write in the book of Divine Works. In the youthful, ripening period of life, we come into complete flower. In old age, we are brought back to the period of fading, just as earth in summer is adorned with flowers by its greening power, and later transformed by the chill of winter's pallor. When the soul overcomes the body in such a way that the body is in agreement with the soul in goodwill and simplicity of heart, and refreshed by good treatment, as if by nourishing food, we cry out in our longing for heaven, "How sweet are the words of justice to my throat, even sweeter than honey to my mouth." And so we live in childish simplicity and a state of innocence, without feeling the desires of the flesh. The soul floods us with its longing until, as we climb from virtue to virtue, we begin to feel a greening power. And there's her trademark right there, the greening power, viriditas. We start to bloom, says Hildegard, in the good works and examples left to us by the Son of God. And so we find joy and let ourselves be adorned. And just as the greening power and the flowering, as well as the ripening of all fruits, come to an end in winter, we also fade away with death. Those of us, however, who have performed good works in our childhood, maturity, and old age will mount up with our soul to God, radiant in our good deeds, and as if adorned with jewels, which Hildegard loved. She loved to be adorned with jewels. And the body by which the soul has done all these things will scarcely be able to wait until both body and soul are together again in the abode of joy. So in this talk, I've brought you to the place where Hildegard began, at Disi-Bodenberg, in the rich Rhineland of Germany, a very ancient and holy place. And we've gone over some of the ideas of how Hildegard's character might have been forming as she lived in that anchor hold and sang the divine office and learned rudimentary Latin and perhaps to play an instrument and to do sewing and so forth. How she went inward and her soul began to really bloom and blossom. Topic 4, the spiritual life of a visionary. One of the most notable facts about Hildegard of Bingen was her ongoing visionary life. From the time she was an early child, she experienced these light-infused visions. This topic, this talk, will delve a bit more into the mystery of those visions. Now we find Hildegard in her 30s. She reports being almost always in the presence of the shadow of the living light. While she was with Jutta, her visions were ongoing. The anchor hold and the Benedictine rule, with its communal singing of the divine office 7 or 8 times per day, held Hildegard safely as her visionary life, her inner life, continued. Jan Richardson writes this: "In the midst of your life, in the daily of it, the ordinary of it, the noontime and night of it, let there be moments that open to you the hallowed and the holy of it." This would certainly be true for Hildegard as she is living quietly under the supervision of Jutta. Hildegard has yet to put anything down in writing. Her great texts, with their amazing art, are in her future. She is an ardent observer of life and the workings of God, and she will later write, "The report of Creator's miracles come to all of God's creation, so that miracle is piled upon miracle in a great thunder of words. And then man, struck by the greatness of these miracles, feels the impact in his mind and body, and in these wondrous deeds considers with astonishment his own weakness and frailty." As we have discussed just a bit, Hildegard herself was frail. It has long been supposed that she suffered from migraine illness. Madeline Cavaness, writing in Voice of the Living Light, discusses Hildegard's illuminations. She's not done these yet while she's in her 30s, but Madeline is looking upon them now to give us information about her health. Madeline Cavaness says features that have long been recognized as reflections of the visual disturbances typically associated with migraine attacks are in these illuminations. These include irregular, jagged-edged forms that spread aggressively over the framed surface. Cavaness tells us that clinicians can recognize this as the result of visual disturbances, and that these aberrations come from a deficit in the visual field. She tells us that Hildegard's illuminations also feature stars, which may be influenced by scintillating scotoma, and that is shimmering spots in the visual field. Hildegard's visions were often accompanied by weakness and illness. However, the diagnosis of migraine does not explain her amazing output of visual art or her ongoing creation of theological text. Her art was done with help from other artists, but they came from her own deep visual images. So this migraine diagnosis does not explain all these creative works. I feel that Hildegard created in spite of her physical limitations, not because of them. Working in her usual holistic way, she would have recognized the aberrations in her visual field and the pain she suffered as part of the whole, her call to be a prophet of God. At Dissy-Bodenberg, Jutta is nearing the end of her life. She will die in 1136. Hildegard has confided her visions to Jutta, and either Hildegard or Jutta has told the monk Volmar about the visions. We might take a moment here to examine some ideas about women's spirituality. These ideas have been expounded upon by Father Richard Rohr and others. In traditional societies, which Hildegard certainly lived in, women begin their lives one down, so to speak. They are not given the place in society that men are given. And because of the biological processes that they go through, or maybe because they are not encouraged, they do not tend to go out into the world as quickly as men do. Certainly not in Hildegard's time. They are not powerful in the ways men in their society are. Therefore, what usually happens is that women make a descent into the inner self, or as Hildegard would say, the soul. They descend there early in their lives in preparation for a rising up later in life into the larger world. We find Hildegard now in the cloister making that immersion into her inner life, into her inner self. Hildegard spent 30 years with Jutta, making that descent into herself to find the goal there. Her ongoing visions were the food and drink that sustained her, and eventually she didn't keep them to herself completely, as we said, confided to Jutta, who told the monk Volmar, who eventually told the abbot of the monastery, Kuno. Neither Jutta nor Volmar condemned Hildegard's visions. Now Hildegard began to struggle with what God was telling her to do through the visions. In a later letter to Wybert of Gembloux, a Benedictine monk very interested in Hildegard's life and visions, Hildegard, as an old woman, tries to explain what she has experienced in those visions. This letter has become famous because it is a time where we have Hildegard talking about what she actually experienced. And she says, "From my childhood days, when my limbs, nerves, and veins were not yet strong, the gift of these visions brought joy to my soul. And this has remained true up to this very time," and she's writing later in life, up to this very time when I am a woman more than 70 years. And as God wants, my soul climbs into the vision high above, even to the height of the firmament. But I do not see these things with my external eyes, nor do I hear them with my external ears. I do not perceive them through the thoughts of my heart or through the mediation of my five senses. I see them much more, Hildegard says, in my soul alone. With my physical eyes open, in such a way that I never experience the unconsciousness of ecstasy, but I see all of this awake, whether by day or by night. Hildegard continues, the light which I see is not bound by space. It is much more light-filled than a cloud that carries the sun itself. There is nothing in it to recognize of height, length, or breadth. It was described to me as the shadow of the living light. And just as the sun, the moon, and the stars are reflected in water, so writings, talks, powers, and certain actions of people are illuminated for me in this light. She closes by saying, it is in this light that I sometimes see, though not often, another light that I call the living light. When I read this, I thought about the fact that Hildegard was so often in the shadow of the living light, but on occasion, she was ushered into the throne room and was actually in the presence of the living light, God. She says, when and how I see this, I cannot say. But as long as I see this living light, all sadness and anxiety are taken away from me. Writing at age 70, she says, the result is that I feel like a simple young girl and not like an old lady. Jutta dies in 1136, and the nuns ask Hildegard to be their magistra, their leader. And we've mentioned this before, in Jutta's place. Hildegard is 38 years old. She demurs, but they persuade her. It would seem that her leadership and intelligence are obvious to her companions, as is her compassion for her sisters. We mentioned that the burgeoning monastery of women meant that the wall of the cloister came down and a door was put in, and that Hildegard and others had a bit more freedom going to different places in the monastery, including the scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied and preserved, and into the larger gardens. This would inspire and form the woman Hildegard. Let's take a minute and think about Jutta and Hildegard's relationship. They were very different, and yet Jutta had served as a sort of mother for Hildegard, a container perhaps, an authoritarian figure, but now she's gone. And Hildegard is just beginning to rise up into her own light, her own power. She didn't agree with a lot of what Jutta had done. We said that Jutta had withdrawn from the world. Hildegard wanted to be very much engaged with the world, even in the cloister, and she was. Now something is about to happen that will demand that Hildegard move outward in a bold way. We talked about women's spirituality, going inward. And now Jutta's gone, and Hildegard is about to come outward, but it will take more time, more diplomacy, more letters for her to do so. Something is about to happen that will demand that Hildegard move outward in a bold way. It is the major vision she will experience in 1141. She is now 42, almost 43 years old. This extensive vision led to the creation of her first book, Scivias. But there is much diplomacy, much to do before that book comes into being. It will take 10 years. But she writes in the declaration portion of Scivias, "And behold, in the 43rd year of my earthly course, as I was gazing with great fear and trembling attention at a heavenly vision, I saw a great splendor in which resounded a voice from heaven saying to me," well, the voice said to her that she was a fragile human being and dust from dust, timid and untaught, and yet she was to speak of what she was receiving, not by human mouth or understanding, but in her words, "As you see and hear them on high, in the heavenly place, in the wonder of God." Hildegard will expound over and over that she writes, that she says nothing, that she does not receive directly from God. Of this great vision, she continues, "It happened that in the 1141st years of the incarnation of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, heaven was opened, and a fiery light of exceeding brilliance came and permeated my whole brain and inflamed my whole heart." Hildegard says that through this vision, she understood all the scriptures, the Psalms, and the Gospels, and other biblical texts as well. At this time, Hildegard tells us that God has laid her low in order that she might be an instrument for him. After the vision and the command to speak, she becomes very ill. Hildegard's story is in keeping with the biblical message of the last shall be first, and God's using the unworthy and the unprepared for God's greatest work. For example, King David, who was the youngest in his family, Moses, the liberator, who had a speech impediment, Mary, the mother of God, who was very young, innocent, and powerless. Jesus himself said in Matthew 11:22, "I give you praise, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have kept these things secret from the wise and the men of learning, and have made them clear to little children." While no longer a child, Hildegard was a weak woman in her own words and unlearned. In her own eyes, not really in mine, but in her own, she was a little one. But yet she was called by God. The classic call from God. Author Marjorie Zoet Bankston tells us, "I see call not as a vocational choice, but as a special way of understanding what we are here for. Being able to name our changing field of work. Being able to name our changing field of work in the world, and to know when it is complete, when it is time for a new call to being." She continues, "When we live out a call to write, or teach, or build, or to parent in such a way that we treat life as a sacred gift, we are responding to an invitation to wholeness. We are also responding to the unseen mystery and holiness of life itself." In 1141, Hildegard has experienced a great call. Writing in Hildegard of Bingen, A Visionary Life, Sabina Flanagan tells us, "Yet it was not simple, subjective understanding that Hildegard gained by means of her visions. She also claimed for herself an educative mission. The possibilities for such instruction were either by writing or by preaching. Hildegard's mission, as she now conceived it, seems to have been chiefly concerned with setting her visions down in writing." And the quote continues, "Perhaps this was because while there were definite prohibitions against women preaching, the issue of their writing was much less clear-cut. Although her instructions in the vision that she received was write and say, that could be applied to both writing and preaching. And her main preaching activities belong to a time much later in her career." Again, Hildegard always stressed, and this was so important to her, that people knew that during her visions, she was not swooning, not in an ecstasy like Teresa of Avila was. She was not asleep and dreaming. The process seems to be both otherworldly and very gentle and direct for Hildegard. Light infuses her with knowledge, and she sees things formally beyond her understanding in this light. The light does not burn her. It illuminates her. It is like the gentle light of the sun. In this light, God is both transcendent, above the world in great splendor, and immanent in the world, all parts of the world, every piece of the world. God is indwelling in all things. Hildegard sees a God on a throne, and yet, sweet caritas, love, is present, and with her the womanly figure of wisdom. So what will happen now? Hildegard has been called and commanded to write what you see and hear. How can she move forward? We'll find out in the next talk. To review, Hildegard was marked by her visionary life. Her visions were ongoing and imbued her with knowledge. She always was to claim that every prophetic word she wrote came directly from God. We have discovered that in 1141, a major vision came to her that will lead to the great text, Scivias. She is being called now, called forth into the larger world. And in our next lecture, we'll see how she goes forward. Topic 5, Scivias. This talk will center on the text and illuminations that came forth from Hildegard's major vision in 1141 and the ways she was able to move forward to create her text. Scivias is an extensive book of theology, and it is the first text that Hildegard was to write. Remember, the year is 1141. Hildegard has had a major vision and has been commanded to write about what she has seen and what she has heard. Scivias, or Know the Ways of the Lord, would be a towering work. The Paulist Press English translation, without introduction and endnotes, is 539 pages long. How was this text created? Hildegard wrote on a wax tablet with a stylus and passed it to her secretary Fulmar, who wrote in ink on parchment. This was done with the help of a nun, a favorite nun thought to be Richardus von Stade, and they all worked together. The process took 10 years. In her vision, Hildegard had been given the meaning of creation, the laws of God, the Redeemer, the sacraments, the church, the Trinity, the virtues, and even more sacred ideas. Hildegard received complex sacred images with the visions. In fact, the visions are great sacred images. They are filled with beauty and power. In her visions, Hildegard is illuminated and receives intellectual knowledge about many things. The paintings illuminating the manuscript are believed to have been directed by Hildegard and completed with the help of various artists over the years. Writing in God, the oldest question, William O'Malley states, "A mystery is open-ended. You're never going to nail it down. Nor is God the only mystery. Love, what lies beyond death, the prosperity of the cynical, the failure of the good-souled, all are unfathomable." The fascination of genuine mystery is not that it baffles, but that it opens up like a lotus. It invites exploration, but it defies conquest. This is true of Hildegard's illuminations and writings. They open up like a lotus. They defy conquest. But how was Hildegard able to write down what she received? Let's remember she was a woman in the 12th century. Women were forbidden to preach, and very few wrote or had anything to say about theology. Those who did write about theology were classically trained men. She needed many permissions before she could proceed. Hildegard states that she refused for a long time to write down her vision because of doubt and evil opinion. We might say simply, she was afraid. She knew well the penalties for heresy. She was just an uneducated woman, as we said. How could she speak of these things? In God's Passionate Desire, Father William Barry says this, "Fear sits deep within each one of us. We are afraid of so many things: the dark, the discovery of our secret fault or flaw, sickness, pain, loss of money or prestige or reputation, loss of our loved ones, death itself. Fear keeps us from trusting other people, from trying new things, even from enjoying life." Barry says, "I venture to say that fear may be the manifestation of the original sin in our lives. Because of fear, we find it very difficult to live out the dream of God for our universe. That is, to be a place where all people live in harmony with the perfect community that is the triune God and with one another." So at this point, Hildegard is filled with fear. In this fear, she states that she became sick, pressed down by the scourge of God. She reveals that she was ill for a very long time, with different illnesses. As we have said, we are fairly sure that Hildegard suffered from migraine illness. That would have gotten worse with this kind of stress. Her illnesses may have had some psychosomatic elements, in that her stress and her fear made her ill health worse. She was not faking illness, but her mind and her body were conspiring against her. We know that psychosomatic does mean psyche, mind, and body, soma. And a psychosomatic disorder is a disease which involves both body and mind. Some physical diseases are thought to be particularly prone to be made worse by mental factors such as this sort of stress, this sort of anxiety. And a person's current mental state can affect how a physical disease is perceived at any given time. Hildegard is now under a great stress as she is commanded by God to make her visions known by publishing. She is between God's command and her fear of the church hierarchy. She has begun to confide in Folmar, who lives in the monks' portion of the monastery. And she has begun to enlist the help of that noble woman, Richardis von Stade. Richardis had received a lot of education in Latin at home before she came to the monastery, and she was to be very helpful to Hildegard and a beloved of Hildegard. But there are still many hurdles. Folmar goes to the abbot, Kuno, and obtains his permission for Hildegard to write. They contact the Bishop of Mainz, who sends a group of prelates to examine Hildegard, and she seems to pass muster. This whole episode of receiving permissions tells us a lot about Hildegard's familiarity with power and the ways that influence worked. She knew she had to garner these permissions, and so she used what she knew about power for good.